Oh, there's nobody there. Oh, I see. Now there's somebody there. They're dismantling as I speak. Over time, as property was donated and as members of the community got older, it became more difficult to obviously keep up the wandering. And then viharas, bodhimandas, temples, way places, monasteries became more and more permanent until that's pretty much what we have today along the continuum. There's still a lot of wandering and going on within the tradition, but there's also a very sedentary establishment of temples, monasteries like here. And yet, the spirit of the monastery or the temple is to produce a feeling of wandering while you're here. And so it's set up in such a way as to have the minimum of kind of the accoutrements of life, and all the food and the medicine and clothing that comes into the temple here are donations. And so there's no holding of personal wealth or property, which was easier to be done when you're wandering because you can't carry very much with you. And so the idea was to, both at the inner level, the spiritual level, and the outer level, to cultivate an attitude or a disposition of fewness of desires, fewness of wants, by not acquiring and accumulating material things, or even a sense that this is my place, I belong here. So often in the early tradition, monks and nuns would wander, and they would have one practice. They wouldn't stay for more than 3 nights in a single place under a single tree, and they'd move on. Of course, that was in southern India, and you can do that, and you can have minimum robes in southern India too, and a number of other things. When it starts to go north to Tibet, China, and Korea, and they have a thing called winter, and when winter comes, it's a little harder to sleep under the same icicle for 3 nights in a row. And so monasteries and temples came, but they also were by design meant to be rather austere and Spartan-like, because they wanted to cultivate this sense of not identifying with comfort and attachment. So even today, if you go to a good temple or monastery, you'll feel a little bit, how do I say, it's not a 5-star experience. It's not even a 4-star experience. It might be an asterisk at best. It's not even a 1-star. It's a tiny experience. And you feel a little bit not quite comfortable. The food isn't that great. There's not a lot of entertainment. Often there's no newspapers or magazines. The sleeping accommodations are a little bit uncomfortable. They're not totally uncomfortable, but so often there's drafts, there's bugs. What else? In the winter it's a little chilly. Anybody else have experiences of staying in monasteries? There's not a lot of socializing, so it's not like happy hour at 4 in the afternoon or something.
Share rooms with others?
Huh?
Share rooms with others.
Sometimes you have to share rooms with others, so your sense of ego gets a little put upon. And even often the offerings that come in are not the best of things. Now, this is sometimes by design, but it's also because people only sometimes make offerings when they're tired of the toys. Well, I'll give it to the monastery, this broken TV, this broken computer. And so there's that feeling that you're not living at the high end, even if you are in a monastery. And of course, when we were in monasteries, we got moved around even from monastery to monastery, so it was always a different experience. In the West, when the Dharma was first coming in, there weren't really any monasteries. I mean, this is a monastery, but it really was a church. So it's being converted into a Buddhist monastery. It used to be a church. And let's see. I think back up there was the baptismal font. There was actually a pool behind the altar, so you could have immersion baptism. And we don't do that, so that got filled in with something else. And there used to be there's still an organ. There used to be 2 organs up here. Nobody plays the organ, but this is a carryover from that. And then the pews were moved out, so you'll see the pews in the kitchen, but there used to be pews here, and then so forth. And then that was the pulpit. So we've converted into monasteries everything from old YMCAs to big houses to old churches. I'm trying to think what else we might have used. In Canada was the old Salvation Army. So we got that building, which was quite a unique experience, changing that into a monastery. And even a motel. There's one in a motel. And we almost did an Air Force base at one time. In any event, and the City of 10,000 Buddhas is our flagship institution, but that was a mental hospital. Now, of course, some of you are thinking very appropriate that everything's made from the mind alone, right? So, but that was a former mental hospital. And then the monastery, the actual monastery called Tathagata Monastery, was, where I stayed, housed the criminally insane. So we moved into the most austere of environments. The walls were, I think 1.5, 2 feet thick with rebar every 3 inches. And in fact, at one point somebody had purchased it and they wanted to just level it and turn it into orchards, vineyards up there. But when they applied for a permit to demolish the building, they couldn't get it because the engineers said the amount of dynamite it would take to level that building would take out 3/4 of Mendocino County. And so it remains, to this day, an institution for the mind, but not for the criminally insane. So in this case, this is rather a little a mix of both. He has a place here, but he's also renovating it. It has fallen into ruin. So one of the things that the Sixth Patriarch does, and great masters like Han Shan and Shu Yun do, they go around, they rejuvenate the dharma. They bring it back to the mind ground level. They take it out of all the sort of superstitious accretions that may have accumulated either by having too much wealth for the religious body or too much worldly political engagement, too close to the realms of power and so forth, or they've lost sight of the heart of it and they're into the surface of it, going through just the rituals and the ceremonies, but not having the real lifeblood of the mind ground, this direct teaching that he's talking about. So on one hand, they reform it from within, bringing the heart of it back in a very, very lively, direct way. At the same time, they devote a considerable amount of energy and resources to renovating old monasteries that have fallen into ruin. And so he's doing the same thing here. He's going back to an ancient place, renovating it, and at the same time, he's holding the ceremony here. So it's a little bit of polish and roughness simultaneously. So what's going on here? He's obviously has a great gathering of people here, and a lot of people who read this chapter try to figure out, well, is he giving an ordination? Is there something going on where he's ordaining people? And I think what you'll see as we go through this, that kind of mind or thinking is not something that occupies his attention. He's not occupied what we would call in Chinese xiang, which is the mark or the appearance of something. And that's why he says my teaching is wu xiang, without marks. It's not paying attention to the surface of things, it's going into the substance of the heart. And he says, when I teach to the mind ground level. I teach to that potential for awakening that's universally present in all living beings. I don't think of you as lay or left home or man or woman or educated or not educated. I'm teaching right to that heart. And so because he does that so directly, it's easy for people to assume that he was out to some egalitarian agenda or he was trying to put down ecclesiastical authority or something. No, I don't think that's a correct reading. My reading is he's got one message as a direct teaching right to the mind, to the heart of the human, and the transformation of that into its full potential, which is Buddhahood. And that's all he's doing. Now, other people can say he's doing this or that, but when he sits down to initiate people into the Dharma here, this is a very powerful, direct spiritual experience he's making available to people. He's not mincing it. He's not saying, okay, this morning we're going to do lay people, this afternoon we're going to do left home, or we're going to do women here, men here. He's just got everybody together, and he's shooting straight from the hip, or you want to say more straight from the heart, the true mind. And so he starts simply, we go right into it. You remember the first thing we read last week. he just takes it right in. He says, at every day, at all times, right where you are, that's the place, that's the ground of awakening, that's the monastery, that's the temple. And he says, you do this work yourself, train yourself, only will you not come in vain. So he's really stressing this with everybody, no matter what you might have brought with you. Some of you may have memorized text. Some of you might have been in robes for many years. Some of you may be completely new. It doesn't matter. From his point of view, there's only one way to get awakened, and that's by cultivating yourself. The rest of all, is just not really that important until and unless it leads to that. Then he says, because you've gathered, we have this karmic connection. Now he's going to, though, at the same time, take them in a ceremonial way. And I guess I will say this at the beginning, too, that I myself, at least initially, when I drew nearer to these teachings in the late 60s and early 70s, was coming out of a time, a culture, a zeitgeist, if you will, the spirit of the times that was very informal, not very formal. And rituals and ceremonies of a high order like this, we sort of looked down upon. We wanted to get real down and, past the appearances of prestige and privilege and power and all this sort of thing, and ceremony. We wanted to be real, straight. And so we often eschewed or, just like, we don't want to do that. And over time, I began to realize that certain ceremonies and rituals, if done correctly, and if performed in a way that the participant in the ritual are really, I don't know what the word is, sincere, they can have a very powerful transformative effect. So while I started out poo-pooing rituals and devotions and ceremonies, I've now come to not just begrudgingly, but almost openly be interested in them and see them for something other than just a invocation of other power, if you want to use that language. In other words, why am I bowing? Why am I offering this? I'm offering this to this other power, this deity, who will in turn, because they're happy with my offering and whatnot, bestow upon me my wishes, my supplications, my desires. That mentality is often how ceremonies and rituals were presented to me as a young person. When you see what's going on here, he's actually saying, this ritual, this ceremony I'm taking you through is not something that's going to be done to you, but it's something you're going to do to yourself. And by immersing yourself in this, you will have, or you'll be open to an experience where the agency of change is not so much in the external ritual or devotion, but in the change of mind or heart that this exercise, if done well, will invoke in you. And this is quite unique. So that something that could be just a superficial, perfunctory thing can become a very meaningful and transformative event if done properly. So I'm very much interested in looking at ceremonies and rituals and devotions with new eyes that weren't carryovers from this past. That isn't to say that all can do this. And even if you're sincere, all can have this effect. But I'm thinking a right ceremony with the right attitude can be very meaningful. So what he's doing here, he is taking him through the first 5. So 53 to 54, he goes through 5, what he calls, what's the word he uses? The 5 dharma body incenses. We put this in cap because he's using this in a formal way. Now the dharma body he's referring to here, the dharma body instances of the inherent nature, he's basically saying the triple jewel, the Buddha, the Dharma, the Sangha, all the sort of metaphysical abstractions you call the out there powers or whatnot, are really nothing more than your own inherent nature, your own intrinsic nature. So these things, in fact, Buddhism itself comes from this nature. It's not like the nature comes from Buddhism. Buddhism comes from the nature. And all these teachings come from human nature, not someplace else. So he's saying the repository for all of this is in the human. It's in human nature. It's intrinsic and innate, not something outside, even though it's represented that way. Well, this is quite quite a shift for a lot of people who are thinking that this is the holy place, these are the holy statues, and the spirit and the energy resides in the place, in the icons, and maybe in even the religious personnel. And he's saying, no, quite the contrary. It is everywhere, and it's in you, and this is where it actually originates from. So then he says, the first incense is morality. And then again, he defines morality not as, here are the rules you must follow, or the regulations, or the prohibitions, but he says, this is simply your own mind blameless, free from evil, envy, and jealousy, without greed and anger, thieving, or harm. This is called the incense of morality. So he changes it around and says, instead of giving you commandments, which you might think are moral codes to follow, I'm saying to you that morality is your inherent nature free of these things. Now, if you look at it, there's two things going on. One, it's incredibly internal. Because you could say, well, I'm following the moral precepts, but if your heart isn't free from this, you are only following in the letter, but the spirit is not there. And if the spirit's not there, then this as a ground of awakening can't work. This is very interesting, because mere performance of the letter won't produce the result. This is pretty interesting. It's very existential. He's not saying, if you merely perform not killing, not stealing, and so forth, and that is your external appearance, that's okay, that's good, and the world's a better place probably for that. But that's not going to get you awakened unless you're really cleaning it out from your intentions and motivations and impulses and desires. So even though you say, well, I didn't harm somebody, but boy, did I have fantasies about taking them out. But I didn't do it. From the Buddhist point of view, you're creating karma. Mentally, you're creating karma, and it sends waves, if you want, shock waves through your dharma body. And it distorts it, and it puts it out of whack, even though you didn't act on it. And even if you think you didn't act on it, people who are sensitive feel it. What? Yeah, well, I didn't do anything. You don't have to do anything. How many conversations or scenes have you seen where you say, well, you didn't say anything, but. Yeah, the vibe you're putting out is even stronger than if you said something. Okay? So even though you don't externally manifest these things and are, quote, ethical, from his point of view, the morality comes from the freedom from even the internal longings, desires, cravings, and arisings of these negative emotions. And that's why he says, you're blameless. And you're blameless not because nobody can find blame. They couldn't catch you at it. You're blameless because you've done nothing that incurs a sense of shame, regret, remorse. And then envy, jealousy. He goes into very concrete things here. Thieving and harm. This is called the incense of morality. Then he goes on, he says the second one. And so you could see, at least in the first three, anybody, what's going on with these three? As far as a standard trope. Remember the San Bulo She, we talked about the three non-outflow studies, which are the kind of the tripod or the three legs of Dharma. The first one is Shila, second one is Samadhi, third one is Prajna. So here you have, he's doing Shila, which is morality, Samadhi, which is a concentration, and Prajna, he calls them the incense of wisdom. So he's taking the first three, and usually people don't know what they mean by that, sort of like, well, I take Shila, I take Samadhi, well, what does that mean? I don't know. He just said it, But he is now spelling it out. He's saying, oh, and by the way, what concentration is, and again, he's going back, this is not simply sitting with your legs crossed in meditation, or single-mindedly or single-focused, desiring, wanting, aiming after something. The Zen of basketball or whatever, or the Zen of banking. In other words, that one-pointedness is what Zen has to offer the modern American adult, and that if you're one-pointed, you'll get everything you desire. This one-pointedness he's talking about is that you'll get rid of everything you desire. Very different. So he says, this instance of concentration is your own mind remaining clear and undisturbed in the midst of all conditions, good or bad. So here concentration is more like a equanimity. And the equanimity is not a forced equanimity like, let it go, let it go, let it go. It's an equanimity that comes from, so what? Fart, fart. You know, there's nothing to get excited about. Everything I want and crave or fear I'm going to lose are dreams, illusions, bubbles, shadows. So the equanimity comes from just seeing things as they really are, not from repression, right? And so otherwise it's really not concentration, or in his sense, it's really not being undisturbed. Undisturbed means not only do you not react to it, but there's nothing inside of you that wants or fears any of this anymore. Now, this doesn't mean you're dead to the world. It doesn't mean you don't have feelings. I want to really be clear about this. It simply means you're not whipped around by everything. You're there, you're engaged, you're really alert. But there's nothing that's throwing you off kilter, off balance. I mean, really think about it. If I think about all the things that throw me off balance, within, well, it used to be years, then it was weeks. Now sometimes it's minutes and hours. I look and go, what? What were you doing? How did you get blown out of the water over that? Right? Someone, muffed your pride a little? What? But at the moment, that impulse that still arises means that the work is still wanting. There isn't this impartiality towards everything. I'm not seeing everything. When you get muffed, I'm very equanimous. Well, my, what's gotten to your, But when I get it, then I go haywire. And it's like, well, wait a minute. Why do I see the emptiness of other people's negative emotions but not my own? So that's not true equanimity. And so he's talking about here, you're undisturbed because you've seen through it and you've been able to put it down. Now again, seeing through it and putting it down means you don't crave it, you're not after it, and you don't fear losing it. You're just present. This, by the way, is something I had to learn when I was working with, again, severely emotionally disturbed kids. If there was anything in me that wanted their praise, their attention, their acclaim, I was vulnerable. I couldn't be. But if I could step back and actually see them as almost students instead of my, my charges, and see their behavior almost in a clinical way and saying, well, now you've done that, but actually you see what that happens to that card, you really don't want to da-da-da-da-da. I could maintain an equanimity, but it meant I also had to de-invest myself from my ego being connected with their growth and development and whatnot. Now this might apply to parenting. If you saw your children not as yours or as extensions of your ego, but simply as living beings trying to make something of themselves, and your job was to facilitate and help that along, then your reaction to that would not be, I don't care about you, I'm indifferent, I see through and put you down. No, it would be, I am with equanimity trying to nurture and get you to a place where you're standing clear and whole on your own. So just I'm trying to think, wow, this is transcendental. It's actually very worldly. You thought about if you mastered the second one here, you would have really not no relationships with people, but really healthy, wholesome, good relationships, true friendships at many levels. Simply because you're not there to take advantage or to have them fulfill some desire, expectation you need. And I mean, they're not part of your movie script. You're not casting them in your movie script. They're simply other beings like yourself who want to be whole and free and so forth. And nurturing in that way allows you to be, because it's not about you. It's not, if you're not seeking and wanting something from that and projecting, then it isn't about you. And it allows you to be impartial. But impartial with a tremendous amount of compassion and caring. Impartial doesn't mean not caring. It means caring effectively, as opposed to projecting, grasping, wanting, seeking. So that's the second one. The third is the incense of wisdom. And this, he says, is your own mind unhindered by anything, always using wisdom to contemplate and illuminate the essential nature and never allowing evil to set in. So again, his wisdom, again, is represented by not something you get or acquire, but simply letting your natural inherent capacity be unhindered by anything. So again, he always returns to this idea of what we call emptiness. But we have to really understand when he's talking about emptiness, he's talking really about fullness. You almost have to reverse this. What he means by emptiness is the fullness of your nature, unimpeded, unhindered, unobstructed. He calls it emptiness because you have nothing you want, nothing you seek, nothing you're putting in the way of that natural fullness. Therefore, it operates completely, functionally perfect. It's when we put something into it and go out to reach to make something out of it, that it goes from this true emptiness to then a false fullness. So it's very different. So when he's talking about unhindered and so forth, he can use this language because he's starting with a premise, if you want, that we already have everything whole and complete. Whole and complete, having everything means empty. Empty means we don't have to seek anything. We're not lacking. So it's empty of need, empty of want, empty of deficiency. That's what he means by this. Unfortunately, people read this and they read it as a kind of, with a nihilistic sense. Oh, here he's going with his emptiness again. Empty, empty, empty. But I love life. I want to live and so forth. It's not contradictory at all. He's saying the fullness of life, the most full life you can lead is true emptiness. That's why I said this true emptiness is just wondrous existence. Why is it wondrous existence? Because there's nothing obstructing or impeding you. So the fullness of our life isn't because we don't strive hard enough or we don't desire. It's because we can't let go of those things that let it flow and open naturally. That's why the motion, the activity in here is the letting go. But ironically, the more you let go of, as Tao Te Ching says, the more full you become. Well, how does that work? Because we constrain our fullness by reaching, grasping, wanting, fearing, and so forth. I don't know how to say. One way I discovered this, let's see. I'll give you an example from my own personal experience. Well, working with kids was one. As soon as I started to let go that this was about me, my job performance, my success rate with disturbed kids and blah, 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 and just everything started to move a lot easier because I wasn't projecting some agenda. When I was doing martial arts, I found that no matter how hard I trained and how strong I was, every time I would come into a tournament situation, I wouldn't do well. And the reason I wouldn't do well is because I was tightening up. I was choking up. And so the choking up comes from wanting and fear of losing and so forth. And therefore, all my fluid nimbleness was gone. And only when I started to practice meditation and yoga and combine that was I able to go in with an idea of letting go and therefore being responsive. So if you think about it, I saw this wonderful interview with a world-class pianist. And I forget who was interviewing her. And the person said, how do you do that? How do you get all those notes in with your nimble fingers and whatnot? And she said, it's the same secret that weightlifters have. And the interviewer went, what? She says, you're just this puny little woman, and you're comparing yourself with these great weightlifters. She said, but we do the same thing. And the person said, well, what do you mean? She says, the poor weightlifters, the one who never go very far, use all their muscles and try to get it up, and they can't. The really skillful weightlifters have such mastery over their body, they know which muscles to use and which ones to relax. And so they can bring their muscles to a focal point with minimum exertion because everything is just attuned to what needs to be done for that task. She said, in the same way playing the piano, I used to really sweat and try hard. And then I realized it takes very little effort if I knew which part of my mind and my body to use to get these notes. And so it's really, she said, more happens with less exertion. And here's another example, I think, to illustrate this point. What the Sixth Patriarch is saying, when we let go and see through and put things down, and don't strive and don't compete and don't contend and don't worry about our egos and so forth, the fullness of our potential flows unencumbered. That's why he says it flows naturally. And this is one of the words they use, they call this virtue. And virtue means this pure, unadorned, natural manifestation of your true self, of your true energy. So as with art or with athletics, I would say there's probably a lot of other things you would all have experiences with that you can mention, but your highest performance comes from a kind of relaxed letting go rather than super striving and trying too hard. It's the same thing with teaching. You know, when you go into the class, first couple of weeks in the classroom are just pure hell because you're trying so hard. You got your lessons planned, your agenda. In fact, they're so planned and so appropriate, you're not even aware you got people in the room. You're teaching a subject, not people. And so the result, it just flops. Only when you start to relax and let go and trust the process of the dialogue and exchange does real learning start to happen. And then everybody relaxes. So it's the same thing with this. His emptiness means nothing impeding, nothing obstructing this natural ability. Then he says, something very interesting when he says, prajna, one does all kinds of good, but attaches to nothing. This is very interesting. That's a contrast I want to make. In other words, people think, oh, you've reached the state of samadhi nirvana. You don't do anything anymore. You just sit on your duff and, look with tranquil eyes out into the world. No, you do good, but you don't attach to it. Very interesting. Very interesting. He's almost saying, and the good comes naturally because there's no self. And because there's no self, you and others feel as if it's one being. And so you don't even have to use effort to respond. It's as if you're taking care of yourself because you feel this one, it's like the emptiness of self then leads to the fullness of goodness or compassion. So that's why it says, being one with everyone is great compassion. It's not being one towards everyone. Or today I'm one with everyone, tomorrow I'm not. It's actually being one with everyone is great compassion. So there's no distinction made. Why can there be no distinction? Because there is no self set up in an arbitrary demarcation against others. We do think that we exist as separate, autonomous little monads, right? Enveloped by skin and, whatnot on our clothes. But in fact, there's just constant interrelationship interaction going on. Biologically, psychologically, socially. We are not monads. We're not isolated automatons. But we think we are. So therefore, the feedback we need all the time, 24/7, that's coming to us uninterrupted from everything and everybody around us, including the natural environment, which says, help, I'm sick, I'm gagging to die. You say, excuse me, what? Our inability to read the environment, which is just part of our body, has been cut off by this false sense of self. So we go on polluting, defiling, exhausting resources that we would never do with my body. We would not treat our own bodies the same way we treat the natural world. Duh, right? And yet, because we think the natural world and our bodies are two separate things, we go on doing this. The natural, there isn't any distinction between ourselves and the natural world. It affects us, we affect it. It's non-dual. Earth, air, fire, water, interchanging, mingling all the time. Where did we get the idea that we were separate or apart from this? We have to save the environment. What? We are the environment. The environment is us. There's no distinction. That's a bodhisattva's mind. That's the mind that says truly empty. No distinctions, no demarcations of false dichotomies of self and others, and so forth. So we can see these things. They're not so much denials or denunciations or isolating ourselves from things, but they're actually really expanding the full capacity of our innate, right? So that's what it means to awaken. Awaken means that you don't get compassion. It means you stop letting go of what's obstructing it. Okay. So he says, sympathetic towards orphans and the destitute. The way I read this, and I think there's a lot of ways one could read this, but it seems to me, on one hand, he's saying very clearly, if you let your mind be unattached, clinging to nothing, you will naturally be in touch with others. You will naturally be doing what's appropriate. You will naturally have compassion and wisdom manifesting. You won't have to try for these things, because these are the functioning of the nature that is no longer impeded. On the other hand, I think what he's saying here is, if by doing these things you can also trigger an awakening to your nature. In other words, you can go either way. When the nature is unobstructed, clinging to nothing, these things naturally manifest. On the other hand, you can do these things and it will actually catalyze and open up the nature by being this way. And so it's sort of like a behavioral thing that he's doing here. You get my point? For example, sometimes you can think about, oh, my diet. You could say, once I saw clearly that I and all living beings are of a single substance, the idea of eating other living beings was absolutely abhorrent to me, and I just naturally stopped because I saw the oneness, the continuity of life and so forth. That would be prajna just naturally manifesting. On the other hand, you can go and you begin in a conscientious way to start a diet that eats less of living beings, and it starts to trigger in you feelings of kindness and compassion. It opens up a sensibility that was dormant by doing it. And so it can work both ways. You can work on your body to affect your mental state, and you can work on your mental state to affect your body, because in fact they're not two, they're non-dual. So that's why exercises like Tai Chi and yoga have a meditative calming effect on the sensibility of the mind, and vice versa. Exercising meditation in the mind then changes over to your overall comportment and reduces your stress and emotions. It's a complete linked cycle. So here, I think what he's saying, one way to read this, is he's saying, by doing these things, by extending your sympathy, looking at young and old alike, the orphans and the destitute, taking care of them, will actually facilitate the opening of your wisdom, because it's reducing your sense of self. And the biggest obstruction to the functioning of what he calls wisdom is closing down your perception down to me and mine. So wisdom means you're seeing the whole. You're seeing the whole of things. It's a broad, expansive view, whereas me and mine is myopic. It's shrinking it down. And then fourth, he says the incense of liberation. Now he's added two. Anybody have thoughts about why the final two here? Because the first three are pretty obvious. It's Shila, Samadhi, Prajna. But then he adds these last two. He says the incense of liberation, and then finally the fifth incense. I'm still looking into this. I'm not sure. This might be an innovation of the Sixth Patriarch. Any thoughts, anybody? Although we say without thought, it's okay to have thoughts in class and express them. Well, if somebody thinks about it, speak up. We'll look into them now. The fourth is the incense of liberation. This is just your own mind, independent and free of self-seeking, not deliberating over good and evil, unhindered and at ease. This is called the incense of liberation. Be careful not to misread this in saying amoral. In other words, oh, not deliberating over good and evil. Means, I just do what I feel like, and that's moral. That was Ernest Hemingway's definition of morality. Whatever feels good is moral. This is not quite the same.
It's interesting how your translation here has a contrast between liberating and deliberating.
What do you see there?
Well, I never thought about how they could be kind of opposites. So they play off each other in the text. And I guess it's the point that I'm getting from it is that if you're deliberating, then you're not liberated. You're wrapped up in it.
Yeah, I hadn't seen that before, but I think you're right. In fact, what he's saying, liberated means your first thought, your first stirring is to do no harm. It wouldn't even occur, because the liberation is the freedom from a desire to want, to desire to crave, to act in some way that's for me or mine. So if you're truly free, you wouldn't have to deliberate, because it would be so natural. The deliberation comes after you've had two thoughts. You're doing a sort of, what do you call the cost-benefit analysis, right? As soon as you start doing the internal cost-benefit analysis, you're no longer free. You're in a duality conflict. Well, I know this would hurt her, but it'd be really good for me. Or, I know this would screw up the environment, but I'd make $1 million, and then I could donate it back to help the environment, As soon as you start doing that kind of deliberation, you're no longer free. And you're no longer acting what he calls from the free essential nature, you're acting from the calculating nature. And the calculating nature is the nature that is driven by the false sense of self. And so the deliberation comes, if you have to think it over, it's too late. You're no longer free. Now that doesn't mean you wouldn't deliberate if you weren't free. It's like, no. It doesn't mean, well, then just do what you feel like and then you're free. No. He's saying when you've cultivated yourself to the point where your inherent nature is fully present at all points, there's no need to deliberate. But if you're not there, you might consider things a little more carefully before you did them and not simply act on impulse. Because acting spontaneously, what he calls no thought, is not the same as acting on your impulse. It's the impulse that has been transformed into the essential nature's wholeness. That's what's being acted on. That's what he calls first thought, is no thought. Okay. And then fifth, this is one of my favorite passages. I really like this. I thought we could use it as kind of a little description for our university. The fifth incense is the incense of liberated knowledge and understanding. This is just your own mind, unaffected by anything good or bad, neither sinking into emptiness nor clinging to meditative stillness. Study extensively, be learned and well-read. Recognize your original mind and master the Buddhist teachings. Graciously welcome and get along with all creatures. Isn't that great? I love that line. Have no notion of self and other. Directly reach Bodhi, your unchanging true nature. This is called the incense of liberated knowledge and understanding. Wow. So, at one level you could say, so what do we do at our school? All graduates of our school will be perfumed with the liberated knowledge and understanding. What will they be? Well, I don't know if they be. They may not start companies. They may not, do an IPO when they're 19 or 20, but they will get along with all creatures, have no notion of self or others. Well, as a learning outcome, come on, hard to beat. If graduates came out of here, we wouldn't have to worry about the governance of the world. Really, seriously. But very few institutions will take this as their, statement of purpose. But here, I think, again, you can see in the Sixth Patriarch, although he's been misconstrued as emptiness and nothingness and the void and vacuity, look at this. This is a very inspiring and a charge to go out and be engaged in the world. This is actually talking about really something profoundly engaged. He says, you're unaffected by anything good or bad. It doesn't mean you don't notice it. It's just that you're not thrown off. In other words, if something good happens and you're part of it, you don't sort of rest on your laurels and say, oh, I'm a jolly good fellow, look what we did, blah, blah, blah. And if it doesn't go the way you planned, you're not deterred. You just keep going forward because you know it's true. And so good or bad doesn't move you off your destination. You got that kind of conviction. He says, don't sink into the emptiness nor cling to meditative stillness. So at the same time, he's not saying don't meditate, but he says don't turn your meditation into a withdrawal from reality, into an oblivion. It means stillness doesn't mean you're not doing anything. It means you're doing anything without making mistakes. It's very different. So stillness is very active. It's a state of mind that's not attached to anything. It's not trying to manipulate it. It's not trying to get anything. But it doesn't mean not doing. In fact, it's the highest kind of doing. That's also what's meant by Wu Wei. Without doing, it means you do everything. The text says, this person acts Wu Wei without doing. Then the next line says, without doing, everything gets done. Well, wait a minute. How is it without doing, everything gets done? Because it gets done because there's no intervention of the active agent of me doing. And then you go, here he says, study. Study. He doesn't say, burn the books, just sit. Study extensively, be learned and well-read. Now, some people would interpret this as just reading the sutra text, and you could say, yes, study all the sutras. But if you read other sources in this tradition, in the broad Buddhist tradition, you'll see that they had Pandita was an ancient form of a monk who knew the worldly literature and classics and architecture and medicine and so forth, as well as the sacred works. And this was considered to be a high-level monk. A Pandita was someone who'd mastered these. If you look at the Avatamsaka Sutra, you'll see passage after passage referring to the Bodhisattva who masters the worldly dharmas, astronomy, medicine, engineering, poetry, and so forth, and not only uses these expediently to reach living beings, but actually can teach and transform using these as wisdom devices. This is very different to say, well, we teach this sort of as an expedient to gather you in so we can prepare you for the real stuff. Saying, no, a real learned, well-read person can take many bodies and forms of knowledge and use them to generate wisdom and liberation in people. It's not simply sacred works that can do this job. Recognize your original mind, master the Buddha's teaching, graciously welcome, get along with all creatures. This does not mean just on holidays. Okay? At Christmas and Thanksgiving I do this. The rest of the time, these creatures are a pain and I wish they were all gone. Living beings are boundless, let's get rid of them. No, that's not what you're doing here. And have no notion of self or others. Wow. Directly reach Bodhi. That means return to your original nature, your unchanging true nature. This is called the incense. And he says, good and wise friends, these incenses emit a redolence, a perfume within each of you. Do not seek outside. This last line, do not seek outside, is the key to this whole previous passage. He's taken the three refuges, he's taken, they're kneeling there with incense. They're about to feel as if they're going to get something from him. And then he reverses it and said, you are giving refuge to yourselves. You are liberating yourselves by returning to your original nature. In a sense, I'm not tricking you, but I'm actually tricking you to realize it's not outside. I don't give this to you. I'm not a magical priest, a shaman that's going to confer this on you. I am simply a catalyst for you to recognize this is whole and complete with you. This has to be very empowering. This has to be very empowering. And when he's saying do not seek outside, he says don't underestimate yourselves. Don't treat yourselves too cheaply. You are all equally possessed of this nature. High, low, educated, not educated, men, women, children, illiterate, literate, it doesn't matter. You all have this. And if you simply treat yourself with these, if you perfume yourself in this way, which again is not something you buy, it's something you do transformatively within yourself, and it's actually reclaiming your original ground. And by doing that, you become a Buddhist, and according to him, a Buddha, not just a Buddhist. So I just stress this again, and what I wanted to point out here was the whole energy of this event that's taking place is not so much a conference or a granting or even a bestowal, but a transformative energy that he's releasing. I mean, you go away from this feeling like it's the Nike thing, just do it. But you go away from this just feeling what he's doing. He's empowering the people here to actually take themselves across, to liberate themselves, to return to their fullness on their own, through themselves, by themselves. And that's what's meant by this direct teaching. So I was going to share with you a short story. I think I told you before, but it sort of fits, so I'll tell it again. In the early days when we were starting up our association and whatnot, we were in a monastery. It was an old mattress. Oh, I forgot. So there's churches, there's the YMCA, the Air Force, the motel. This is a mattress factory. So this Bodhimanda, which was called Gold Mountain, was actually just an old beat-up mattress factory in the Mission District. And so that's one of the first places we had. And it really was, it was an old, cold, stony mattress factory. And in it, we started to do all these things. And one of the events I was talking about here was one time a very famous Buddhist scholar came because he heard about the teacher and came to have a conversation. And we were sitting in the kitchen after a lunch that wasn't too satisfying because we didn't have good food in those days. And the benches we sat on were just really high. It was plywood. So we had old discarded pieces of plywood that we cut up, and the square of the bench was a little bigger than this round thing on the top, and then it was just hammered together. It looked like, little Bobby Dickies, thing he made with and then we painted it. The only color I think we had around was this terrible yellow-green. That was the paint that was there from that. And so we painted them yellow-green. Those were the benches. And then there was these straight tables, and you just sat there and ate your simple rice and vegetables, and then after lunch, the scholar put up with this, and then finally he said, well, I really need to get going. But I wanted to ask before I go, what's the essence of Buddhism? Right? So it was both a question and a challenge to my teacher, and my teacher says, I'm really a dumb teacher. I myself am not highly educated. I came from Manchuria. I haven't had a chance to really study, but my disciples here, they're all really smart. So he said, let me ask them to give you the answer. What's the essence of Buddhism? And we're all like, well, we'll hit it on the head. And so one person said, prajna, wisdom. The master said, nah, that's not it. And somebody else says, virtue, character. And the master says, nah, that's not it. And then somebody says, I know, it's samadhi, concentration. And I says, no, that's not it. And everybody's like, well, what the hell is it then? And the master says, change. That's the essence of what? Change. And everybody goes, well, what do you mean? And the scholar's going, I never heard that before. And the master said, well, it means everybody who wants to cultivate has to change. It's that simple. So he said, if you come in and you're a bad person, you have to change and become a good person. Because we had people like gang members coming in. And so he was saying, you really, to really become awakened, first you have to not bring your guns to the temple. So let's start at that level. And no grenades. We had some characters. He said, but if you're a good person, you have to become a sage. You have to change and become a sage. And so there was a young disciple there who was 12 or 13 at the time, and he always liked to shine and, get the right answers. And so he had his answer, and it was put down, so he was kind of sucking his knuckles there. And then he jumped in at that point and said, well, what if you become a sage? Then what? And I said, well, then you got to become a bodhisattva. Oh. And he says, well, what if you're a bodhisattva? Then what? And the master says, well, what do you think? Well, then you got to become a Buddha. He said, that's right. He said, and then you can retire. And the master says, no, you can't. What? Why can't you retire if you're Buddha? You're Buddha, then what do you change? He said, you change back into a bodhisattva. And he was like, rats. He didn't get the answer. But the point I'm bringing up in the story was, it seems so simple, almost simplistic, this answer, but if you think about it in relation to what we just read tonight, it's right on. Because all that's being talked about here is change and transformation. There's nothing else going on. Even if you quote, I take refuge in, all you're doing is committing yourself to a transformation. So if you see the 4 vows that are going to come up later, that living beings are boundless, I vow to. Afflictions are endless, I vow to. Dharma doors are limitless, I vow to. The Buddha way is unsurpassed, I vow to. All those vows are commitments to change. So the living beings are boundless, I vow to what? Let them go. No, I vow to help liberate them, transform them. Okay, the afflictions, the klesha, are limitless. I vow to transform, change them, correct them. Because it's from those transformed that you get bodhi. It's transformative. The third one is, I vow to study endlessly, like here. That's a transformative commitment, a change commitment. And finally, the Buddhahood thing, I vow to become the most perfect human being I can, which then becomes Buddha, is again a transformative thrust. There's nothing there that says I vow to have it happen to me, or I vow sometime that I'll be open to be given this, or even that I vow to rest in. It's just this continual transformative energy through even the vows. So I think that's what he's getting at here, what he's doing in this ceremony. On one hand is he's gathering them in and giving them a sense of deep confidence and security in some sort of spiritual energy. And at the same time, he is energizing them to really begin a process of continuous transformation Rather than they take refuge in, it's almost like they're refuging. They're constantly, and they're returning, they're moving. There's a generation from stagnation to real intense activity here, and all of it at the deepest, most quieted place in one's own mind and not outside. So I think we'll go on to this. It's obviously a long chapter, and I know you wanted to talk a little more about repentance. So as we get into the repentance part, we'll go into how that might work. But again, I made the statement last week, and I was thinking about it, did I overstate? And I don't think I did. I think as we read this, we'll realize why the repentance and renewal is more powerful than meditation as his teaching technique. Most people think, well, it's meditation that you get awakened through. I think if we read this carefully, we're going to see it's actually the transformative energy of repentance and renewal that is the vehicle for awakening, and not simply sitting in meditation. In fact, sitting in meditation without this not only will not bring the fruit, but it can lead to distortions. So this is really a very, very important chapter. Anyhow, we'll come back to it next week, all things being equal. Any questions? Yes?
Well, when I look at the 4 and 5, and it's just an idea is, Avatamsaka Sutra has an idea of true emptiness, wonderful existence. So if you look at the 4th one, it really describes the true emptiness, where the mind is not attached, it doesn't seek anywhere, it doesn't abide anywhere. And yet, 5 talks about that even though it's empty, it's not dull emptiness, it's not nothingness, it's not nihilism. It actually allows the wonderful functioning of the mind to come forth and have all these learnings, interact with the beings, and furthermore has no notion of self or others. And you reach beautiful. So it actually matches really well with those 2 concepts.
Very good. Very good. Also pay attention to this. This term, liberation, appears throughout the text. And I'm suggesting that this is the ultimate liberation movement. What this is talking about is not simply a limited liberation based on ethnicity or gender or status or anything else. It's talking about a very profound liberation. And that's why, not just in those 2 there, both are liberation, right? The 4th and the 5th have to do with the idea of liberation. He is talking about something that's extremely powerful in a contemporary sense. He's talking about the most deep, powerful liberation that you can imagine and envision is what he's talking about. He's talking about a free individual that is so powerfully released from all restraints and restrictions, and yet not in any way creating anything harmful. There is nothing binding you, and there's no limitation to the human potential, is what he's talking about in this liberation. So it's like, on one hand, it's timeless, and it's timely at the same time. It's ancient, and it's extremely modern. Because I think the impulse of the modern is towards liberation. It's towards the total freedom from anything that impinges or restrains. In this sense, he's actually putting forth a model of liberation that's actually quite mind-blowing when we get into it. And the 4th and 5th are just the beginning of what he considers to be liberation. So as we go into this, if you're interested in that, because it's one of the central issues of modern philosophy is freedom and liberation. And so what is meant by that here? What does he mean by that? And how could true emptiness be ultimate liberation and so forth? I think this is a very, very interesting text in that way. Very contemporary. Actually, post-contemporary. But next week, we'll go into it more. Any announcements?
We have our schedule tomorrow, 7:30 p.m. We have a next show from Australia. Will be the online lecture.
What chapter are you on in the Avatamsaka?
Now with chapter 7.
What is chapter 7? Oh, yeah, the 7th of the 10 grounds. Okay.
The 10 grounds. And we have also the last week in the City of 10,000 Buddhas, the last week of Bali. If you're interested in that, you can look at it on our website, all information.
He's referring to a 3-week meditation session that's completely centered on bowing, which is part of the repentance ritual. So, and then somebody asked last week, and if you're interested in this, and we'll talk about more as we go on, every week do you do a Dabe Chan here? No.
Yes, every other week.
Every other week, they do about an hour and a half ceremony that is a ritual devotion that's centering on repentance and renewal. It's called the Great Compassion Repentance. So if you wanted to, after you read this chapter and get the interior dimensions of this first, I would recommend that, and then participate in that external ritual, you might have a very interesting connection between how the ritual can work as a catalyst for an inner transformative experience in terms of this. So, I mean, you can do bowing at home, and it's certainly okay, but I think if you did one of those sessions, one of those, the Dabe Chans are called, you'd have a sense. Moreover, in there are mind ground contemplations, and I'll go over some of those next week, so that while you're doing them, you all of a sudden realize that you're doing a contemplation that is washing the interior landscape in a very personal and direct way, and the contemplation is right built in it. So that's another thing. So while you're here, as we go through this chapter, you might want to look into taking one of those up. You don't have to do 3 weeks. That's pretty rigorous. And you might think, oh yeah, but no, bowing is rigorous, because you're not just, you're actually going down into a bow and coming back up again, which of the first half hour is pretty easy, and the hour is way on. You realize your body probably hasn't been bowing a lot, and it's like running a 26K without training. So, but then after a while, you get into a rhythm of that, and it's quite uplifting. So anyhow, we'll do the transference in English. If you have questions, don't embarrass me by asking them, or bring them back next week, and I'll ask if there's questions, and we can start at the beginning with some questions, including online. Who needs the English for this, a handout? If you do, just raise your hand. May every living being, our minds as one and radiant with light, share the fruits of peace with hearts of goodness, luminous and bright. If people hear and see how hands and hearts can find in giving unity, may their minds awake to great compassion, wisdom, and to joy. May kindness find reward. May all who sorrow leave their grief and pain. May this boundless light break the darkness of their endless night. Because our hearts are one, this world of pain turns into paradise. May all become compassionate and wise. May all become compassionate and wise. Ding li san bang.